Dixon experimental sound film is a late 1894 or early 1895 short, best known as the first film made with live recorded sounds. However, if you've read the title of this video, chances are you've already guessed the actual reason why I'm showing it to you. Indeed, this just might be the oldest record of same-sex imagery in film history, which, by the way, might have been completely accidental. There's no actual evidence to support the theory that we're watching an intentional depiction of same-sex intimacy. In fact, this interpretation only truly came to life in 1981, when queer activist and author Vito Russo claimed that the short's title was The Gay Brothers, without explaining where he took this title from. So it's very possible that Russo invented this title after seeing the movie through his own eyes as a gay man. However, regardless of the filmmaker's intentions or even the process behind Russo's claim, it's impossible to ignore the imagery we see in this footage, and Russo's interpretation would only gain notoriety and continue to be shared in the nearly 4 decades since he first introduced it in his novel The Celluloid Closet, a quintessential book to any and all discussions of queer representation throughout US film history. Speaking of which,
in 100 years of movies, homosexuality has only rarely been depicted on the screen. When it did appear, it was there as something to laugh at, or something to pity, or even something to fear.
The Celluloid Closet is also a 1995 documentary which analyzed the evolution of queer representation on film from the silent film days up until the then present.
Hollywood, that great maker of myths, taught straight people what to think about gay people, and gay people what to think about themselves.
Narrated by Lily Tomlin, this movie is extremely important to the discussion of how Hollywood has depicted marginalized communities on film, as well as to the way movies not only reflect the current views of the majority over the so-called minorities, but also have the power to influence these views, going so far as to affect the way marginalized people see themselves. Every piece of art, including film and television as a whole, has the immense capacity of impacting people to the extent of possibly broadening or widening their horizons, forming opinions, stimulating questions, and changing entire worldviews. However, when art is used to depict whole communities, in this specific case the queer community, with no actual awareness or thought given to the responsibility that comes with this power, art can contribute to the oppression of groups that already are historically and systematically oppressed. But what happens when these groups start to leave the margins of society and occupy spaces that allow them to reclaim the way they are depicted in these productions? Well, let's talk about queer representation. The queer community shares a lot in common with marginalized racial groups, in the sense that neither really had any say on the way they were portrayed on screen for most of film and television history, especially during times when mainstream audiences were basically completely ignorant when it came to queer issues. Thankfully, due to queer activism as well as academic studies from the last few decades, there's been a shift toward the better regarding mainstream sensitivity and education on queer identities, which was reflected not only on the amount, but also the way queer people started being depicted by the media. The popularization on the internet in the late 90s and early 2000s also gave a platform to a group that up until then rarely had one, allowing them to express their opinions to a global audience and later, with the advent of social media, to even have direct conversations with the very creators of the stories we consume on television and film. All of that culminated in a bit of a paradigm shift within these industries. Now that the minorities were making themselves heard, claiming for more and better representation, the people responsible for producing these contents were being held accountable in regards to the lack of inclusion and diversity in their work. Of course, this shift didn't happen overnight, and in many ways, it is still happening. The film industry in particular is kind of at a crossroads. With the superinflation of the budgets of mega blockbusters came an ever-growing dependency on the foreign markets, with entire franchises being kept afloat due to box office returns from outside the United States, when countries that Hollywood depends on more than ever, such as Russia and China, have actual laws prohibiting the mere mention of queer identities in public forums. Studio heads tend to start sweating at the idea of including these identities in their films and risk losing these important markets. 2 recent examples came across this exact issue: Disney's live-action remake of Beauty and the Beast and Lionsgate's reboot of Power Rangers. Both movies had a flaccid attempt at including sexual diversity in their stories. Beauty and the Beast here, and Power Rangers here.
Boyfriend troubles.
Yeah.
boyfriend troubles.
Girlfriend troubles?
Even though these moments were the only ones where any semi-explicit reference was made to queer identities, both movies were censored in Russia, receiving a 15 rating. Considering that both Beauty and the Beast and Power Rangers were mostly targeted at kids and teenagers, it's safe to say that less people saw these movies in Russian theaters, and both Disney and Lionsgate lost money. So on the one hand, you have all those queers who have money claiming for inclusion, but you also have not only the homo trans hoes within your own borders ready to threaten a boycott if a gay is in your film they pay to see, but also entire foreign markets that can and likely will censor your film, if you so much as allude to the fact that not everybody on earth is straight or cisgender. It won't appear like you don't support an entire community that also has that valuable disposable income, but you also don't want to alienate a huge chunk of your much needed global market. So how to appear inclusive and diverse without actually being inclusive and diverse? Well, if we're getting into that, we should probably go ahead and define some stuff. Allegory and coding are two similar albeit different concepts, both of which are extremely important to define when talking about queer representation on visual media. Simply put, allegory is an intentional declaration by a work's author, with a direct one-to-one correlation to something outside the story being told. For example, lycanthropy in Harry Potter being an allegory to people living with an STD, most specifically HIV and AIDS. On the other hand, coding is a shorthand, and does not depend on authority or intent. As Lindsay Ellis best put it when she explained the term in her channel,
coding is often careless or unintentional, born from reappropriating tropes without delving into the history of why they're even there in the first place.
great exemplifiers of coding are some Disney villains like Uncle Scar in The Lion King, Governor Ratcliffe in Pocahontas, and Professor Ratigan in The Great Mouse Detective. To quickly express to the audience that these characters are the bad guys of the narrative, they were written as pompous, vain, and a little bit effeminate.
Oh, I shall practice my curtsy.
Thanks to the audience's worldview that associates these attributes in men as signifiers of homosexuality, these villains end up being coded as gay, whether that was the filmmaker's intent or not. Since Disney movies are often babies' first exposure to gay attributes, this coding has the unfortunate implication of gay equals villainy. However, it's important to note that this isn't always how it goes. A lot of times, the use of allegory and coding are the only way queer creators can find to include and depict these identities in the final product, without alienating a chunk of the audience. Which brings me to said audience. According to author Henry Jenkins, who spent most of his professional and academic life studying this phenomenon, fandom is a vehicle for marginalized subcultural groups, women, the young, gays and so on, to pry open space for the cultural concerns within dominant representations. Fandom is a way of appropriating media texts and rereading them in a fashion that serves different interests, a way of transforming mass culture into popular culture. In other words, Jenkins sees fandom as a group of fans of a certain piece of art or artist, reappropriating the official text made by a dominant culture through the lens of marginalization, taking stories that were not made with them in mind and recontextualizing them to their own interests, as a way to find representation where there is none. With that in mind, it's no surprise that many queer people found in fandom a safe space to explore and express their identities. Fandom provides an opening to rectify the previously mentioned custom of mainstream media of erasing or vilifying the queer community. It allows fans to include diversity in incredibly homogeneous texts, and to transform the narrative by reinterpreting characters, plot lines, and relationships through a queer perspective, allowing them, for once, to be the main heroes of their favorite stories. But naturally, some narratives have a certain dose of homoerotic subtext injected into them that makes them much more inherently suitable for this reappropriation.
Gotta be a rope or something! Just go! Get out of here! No, without you!
So this is Stucky. Stucky is the official name designated to the ship composed by Steve Rogers and James Buchanan Bucky Barnes, aka Captain America and the Winter Soldier. Ship, short for relationship, is how fandom designates romantic pairings, canon or not, with the word / coming before ship to categorize same-sex pairings. Steve and Bucky first appeared in a comic book published in March of 1941, and since I can't spend the whole day trying to explain almost 8 decades of material, let's sum it up like this. Steve and Bucky were best friends from childhood who fought together during World War II, up until the moment where Bucky was believed to be dead, only to reappear years later as the Winter Soldier, a brainwashed killing machine with no memories of his previous life. Eventually, Bucky gets his memories back and resumes fighting side by side Steve, even taking over the title of Captain America after Steve was supposedly assassinated. In 2011, Marvel Studios released the movie Captain America: The First Avenger, introducing Steve and Bucky's relationship to a new onslaught of fans outside the printed comic book world. Needless to say, the homoerotic subtext present in their dynamic, as well as the use of classic tragic romance tropes in the story's development, went over the heads of approximately 0 queer people from the Marvel fandom. On the contrary, even the mainstream media and the filmmakers of the Cap movies caught on to the homoeroticism in the Steve-Bucky relationship.
You know it's a little gay, right?
Look, I mean, maybe it was a little Brokeback Mountain at times. I mean, I'll admit it, there's a little I won't quit you, but, everybody cares about each other. What can I say? I'm the first to admit this interview is fun, but I do find it more interesting in that it illustrates how same-sex relationships are treated by a heterosexual audience. The laughs from the crowd, the way the entire exchange is framed as a joke, it all reminds me of what author and activist Judith Butler describes in her book Gender Trouble as the heterocentric social contract which we've all signed as members of society, which results in most people being capable of imagining, admitting, or seeing that the infatuation between two people of the same gender can come from a place of romantic and/or sexual desire. After all, how could two manly superheroes, including one that's been carefully constructed as the embodiment of the physical ideal and moral compass of the United States, be in love and lust with each other, right?
I'm with you to the end of the line, pal.
Right.
Even when I had nothing, I had Bucky.
Let's address the rainbow in the room. Okay, but before we dive into what queerbaiting is, I think we should first clarify what it isn't. Queerbaiting is not the same as the simple queer reading of a perceived homoerotic subtext in a narrative. For instance, my latest obsession, the classic 90s teen soap Beverly Hills 90210. In the second episode, we're introduced to Dylan McKay in a storyline shared with our main Brandon Walsh. For a heterosexual audience, there may not be anything noteworthy in the first scene where both characters directly interact with each other.
Are you hungry? I get next period off. We go grab a bite.
Yeah. Let's do lunch.
But for a queer audience self-trained in reading between the lines in search of representation and identification, well, let me try and translate what it was like watching this scene as a gay man.
Are you hungry? I get next period off. We go grab a bite.
Yeah. Let's do lunch.
So this is an example of queer reading. I caught the queer subtext that, for a straight audience, might as well be invisible, and interpreted it based on my own worldview. What doesn't make the Dylan Brandon ship fall into the queerbaiting category is that at no point was used as a tool to attract queer viewership, with the promise that if you tuned in, they might make Dylan and Brenda get romantically and/or sexually involved in the actual show. I need to emphasize just how important this subtextual reading can be when you're part of a marginalized, underrepresented community. Recognizing the homoerotic subtext in the Dylan Brenda dynamic through your own queer sensitivities is a way of identifying with narratives where people like you are mostly, or even completely, nowhere to be found. Queerbaiting is also not what happens when the creators want to include an explicitly queer relationship on the show, but cannot due to orders from the higher-ups, such as the network that airs and produces the show. This happens a lot in media aimed at children. As some individuals in our society believe and vocalize, there's this idea that same-sex relationships are inherently more sexual and perverted. So the mere notion of mentioning sexual and gender identities outside the cis-heteronorm in kids' media is still mostly seen as a huge and unthinkable taboo. It's the classic,
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
Of course, in order for this argument to fly anywhere near the same galaxy where logic is found, we have to ignore the existence of queer children, who might need the affirmation that there's nothing wrong with them, and that they are not alone. As well as the fact that every single queer person on the planet grew up in the same society where we're taught from birth that girls wear pink, boys wear blue, the prince and the princess get married at the end and live happily ever after. Wanna guess what happened to them? Spoiler alert, they did not turn straight.
No, gay! Me, gay!
But hey, it's best not to point out the holes in this discourse because that's leftist libtard propaganda trying to destroy the traditional Christian values of our society. So now that we know what queerbaiting isn't, it's time to discuss what queerbaiting is. This is gonna be painful. In 2011, I started watching this amazing show called Teen Wolf, a fantasy horror teen series that ran from 2011 to 2017 on MTV, very loosely based on the 1985 movie of the same name.
Wait a minute, are you gonna tell me you're a fag? I mean, if you're gonna tell me you're a fag, I don't think I can handle it.
The show follows Scott McCall, who's bitten by a werewolf in the first episode and put in the position of balancing his normal life as a high school student and this whole new supernatural world he's suddenly involved in. Other main characters include Lydia Martin, Jackson Whittemore, Allison Argent, Styles, and the mysterious Derek Hale. Since the beginning, Teen Wolf already had a certain queer sensitivity, thanks to its openly gay showrunner Jeff Davis. In the second episode, we're introduced to Danny Mahealani, the lacrosse team goalkeeper and the best friend of our jock character Jackson. Danny was popular, liked by everybody, and did not appear to go through any sort of internal conflict due to his sexuality, which was treated with complete normalcy and met with acceptance both by his schoolmates as well as the adults of the show. Even though he wasn't a main character, it was still refreshing to see a queer character being portrayed so naturally. Danny, by the way, apparently matched Jeff Davis' vision for the show. In a 2012 interview to After Autumn, Not a Backlot, Davis said, "I'm trying to create a world where there's no racism, there's no sexism, there's no homophobia. And I know it's not real life, but I kinda don't care. I like to create a world where none of that matters. In my mind, if you can create a world like that on TV, maybe life starts to imitate it." That's a very noble intention, and a fantasy show seems like the perfect place to explore this concept. If you're queer, given the real-life context of the worlds we live in, a fictional world where there's no homophobia is extremely attractive. But even with this olive branch and open invitation extended to the queer community, it did not take long for the audience and the show's creators to notice what was the true golden egg chicken that ended up winning over the gays.
Say one word. Oh, what? You mean like, hey, Dad, Derek Hale's in my room. Bring your gun?
When we first meet Derek, that's also the first time Styles meets him in-universe. What happens after that is the kind of dynamic where neither party can stand the other, but because plot, are forced to not only interact, but actually work together. Styles doesn't trust Derek and wants him out of his life. Derek doesn't trust Styles and finds him annoying. However, they're constantly placed in a position of, let's say, reluctant collaborators, and gradually come around to trusting each other.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. You? You're not going in there. I'm taking my hand off.
Pretty much in the exact moment Styles and Derek were introduced, most of the viewers got onto the homoerotic subtext in their interactions, and so was born the ship's Derek. Part of it came from the natural chemistry shared by the actors playing the characters, Dylan O'Brien and Tyler Hoechlin, but the narrative itself depicts a dynamic that is not that different from, say, Pride and Prejudice. Here we have Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, two people who also meet, immediately dislike each other, but get to know one another better, start opening up, building mutual respect, and when they look up, oopsie daisy, we're in love. What I mean to say is that the subtext in Derek was there. All of the romantic and homoerotic elements were present in the story for those who knew how to read them. But the most notable part of the whole thing was when the creative minds on the show, including Jeff Davis and the main cast, noticed just how popular Derek really was.
When is Derek getting a girl, or should we hold out for a Derek story?
After that, Derek became a reference textbook example of queerbaiting on a TV show. In his now deleted Twitter account, Jeff Davis said he was aware of Derek, he read the Derek tag on Tumblr, and joked with a fan who said that one way Derek could happen in the show was if they introduced a type of wolfsbane that made werewolves horny, replying with, "That is actually a really good idea, LOL. But perhaps the most shameless of all queerbaiting happened with the incident, "We're on a ship."
Tyler.
Yeah.
Wake up.
No.
We're on a ship. Pun intended. We want to ask if you guys could vote for Teen Wolf with the Teen Choice Awards for the
Choice Summer Show, right?
Best Choice Summer Show. Yep. Can you please do it? Because if you do,
We'll take
that's all that needs to be said.
So, what we have here is two actors from a popular but non-canonical slash ship directly insinuating that if the show's fandom votes for it to win an award, then the ship will be explicitly written as a romantic relationship in the narrative of the program. Cool, Teen Wolf got their awards. Wanna know what happened to the ship after that?
I think Steric is a bizarre, weird, twisted thing, and I think that anyone who pays more attention to Steric than the show isn't watching the show for the right reasons.
Hey, I know we actually used this ship that is so loved by you guys to promote the series when I had to build an audience from scratch, but now I think Steric is a bizarre, weird, twisted thing, and that you shouldn't be watching the show for the thing we exploited in order to get you to watch it in the first place. This interview with Tyler Posey was released in February of 2014, and needless to say, the Steric shippers weren't at all happy with the actor's statement. For starters, it came in the worst possible moment. Only months after Heckling revealed no longer be allowed to sign Steric-related material in fan conventions. Besides that, it was at the very least insensitive of Posey to take a same-sex ship, one that was so important to queer viewers, and call it bizarre, weird, and twisted. But the true bizarre thing after that is that at the same time the talent behind the show seemed to be trying to kind of kill the whole Steric phenomenon, to the point that in season 4 there was a noticeable drop in the amount of things Styles and Derek shared, and both characters had opposite sex love interests introduced. Teen Wolf still exploited the ship up to its last episode. Tyler Heckling had left the cast after season 4, and Dylan O'Brien spent most of the show's 6th and final season absent due to other obligations. But once it was revealed that Heckling would return for the series finale, this is how they promoted the second half of the last season.
You think you're doing this without me, did you? Without us?
You can see why this reignited the hopes of Steric shippers. The final episode could be the chance to come through with the promise they made when they put Heckling and O'Brien on that boat, since they had nothing left to lose. But when the show ends, it's implied that Styles is in a relationship with Lydia, and Derek ends up by himself. And that's when I have to ask, what is this show's deal? They spent years using Steric as a promotional tool up until the very last possible moment. And in the end what happens is nothing. There's no evidence that the writer suffered censorship by MTV out of a fear of alienating the homophobic viewers of the show. So how can one interpret this whole situation, especially taking into account Davis's claim that he wanted to create a world with no homophobia, as anything other than the most obvious case of queerbaiting that could have possibly happened? In 6 seasons, Teen Wolf never had a queer character as part of the show's main cast. They had supporting queer characters, yeah, but the fact that none was ever inserted in the show's core cast seems to go against Davis's idea of creating a world where sexuality isn't an issue. If anything, in hindsight, it makes Davis's claim seem more like a cynical attempt at looking progressive and inclusive without bothering to do the work of writing inclusion and representation in the narrative. Back to Steric and the concept of coding. Teen Wolf made plenty of textual references in which the Styles and Derek dynamic, as well as the characters themselves, were quoted as possibly queer.
Get him off of me. Oh, I don't know, Derek. I think you two make a pretty good pair.
So you also like boys?
Absolutely. Do you?
I said I love you.
At first sight, that could count as queer representation, since even though it was never made explicit in the show, many moments translated the concept of queerness as per part of the audience's worldview. But that's when we turn to French author and philosopher Roland Barthes. In his essay, The Death of the Author, Barthes says, "Literature is that neuter, that composite, that oblique into which every subject escapes, the trap where all identity is lost, beginning with the very identity of the body that writes." In other words, Barthes defends that every text must be read and interpreted by itself, regardless of an author's identity or intention. Even though Steric was a popular ship, going so far as to be embraced by the creators at the beginning, it was never made canon in the show itself. Any and all queer discussion and interpretation derived from it was taken from the subtext, and as a result, queer audiences still had to reappropriate and recontextualize what was presented to them, since the narrative itself never showed Styles and Derek as explicitly and unarguably queer. So according to Barthes, this doesn't count as representation. Two major things happened in 2018 for the discussion of queer representation in visual media. The first was the release of the coming-of-age romantic comedy Love, Simon, the first movie to be widely distributed by a major studio starring a gay protagonist. There was a lot of pressure for this movie to succeed. since the message studio execs could take from it if it flopped is that people weren't interested in films focused on queer narratives, and the community will continue to be underrepresented. Thankfully, that didn't happen, and Love, Simon was a critical and commercial success. The second thing was Glad's annual report Where We Are on TV, which tracks the number of queer characters in primetime shows in the United States. Glad revealed that in the 2018 season, queer characters made up 8.8% of the main casts in all tracked shows, an all-time high in over 2 decades of reporting. This number might still be low, but it shows that queer representation is growing on TV, unlike in the film industry, which is still reluctant in diversifying its productions. But with the current competitive market and the success of Like Simon proving that there is indeed an audience for these stories, isn't it time for the film industry to change its approach?
We have seen time and time again the film industry having to fight not only to keep itself alive, but to keep it the most culturally relevant thing.
Hollywood has a problem with diversity regardless of what kind is being discussed. However, recent productions with race and gender diversity are reinventing whole genres and fattening out studios' faults. Which leads me to saying, no, it isn't time for the industry to change its approach. That time has long passed. But it seems that just now they are understanding and trying to keep up with the times. The higher amount of queer representation on TV also brings up the point of representativeness, i.e. how well are we presenting what is being portrayed. As proven by Teen Wolf, queerbaiting or minimally representing the queer community is no longer enough for an audience that now has more viewing choices than ever. Queerbaiting is breadcrumbs. It's a facade. It's winning diversity brownie points, but not being brave enough to take a risk and possibly alienate the homotransphobic viewers. When more and more shows are including queer characters in their main cast, more and more narratives are being written, and the queer community has more and more story options in which to find representation and identification, maybe studios and producers should pay attention to these voices. I don't think it's smart to keep believing queer people will be satisfied with breadcrumbs, when so many other productions are now offering them a full course meal.